What's up, Professor Wergleys? We're going line by line through this application. Look how I'm building this app. Okay, I don't write all this code and then test it to see if it works. I do piece by piece, step by step. First, see if I can get the search string. If I can get the search string, see if I can build the URL, then print it out. Once I do that successfully, then create the URL and run it and see if I can print out the JSON. Once I can do that successfully, then parse the JSON. If I write all this lines of code at once and I get some error, I'm not going to know where it is. If I do it step by step, then I can run it, see if there's a problem, make sure it works. Once it's solid, then continue. That's the best way to program. If I write 1,000 lines of code and I go and run it and I get a bug, who knows where the bug is? Who knows what the problem is? And then I got to go comment out line by line to see if I can see where the bug is. If I build a code step at a time and I make sure that code is solid before I proceed, then you're going to prevent bugs from occurring and your program is going to be solid. Every time I talk to a Google engineer, they always say they want to build code that lasts forever. If you want to build code that lasts forever, you got to do it step by step and make sure it's thoroughly tested before you proceed. Now that we got the JSON string, we're going to parse the JSON newsfeed. Let's take a look at this method. So first, I'm going to clear the old news stories. Let's say I search University of Missouri, and now I just search Missouri. I don't want those stories combined. So you'll see news stories is an array list of the New York Times news story type. Remember what the New York Times news story type was. I have the web URL, headline, snippet, lead paragraph, news desk, section name, and source. So I'm going to clear that array list. I don't want to mix the news stories. So I'm going to clear that. And I'm going to check the JSON string. Okay, is the JSON string null or is it empty? If it is, there's no reason to continue. If I have an empty JSON string, I'm not going to be able to parse it. Then you'll see I use a JSON object here. Now this JSON object is actually from the JSON simple third-party library. Okay, this is not part of the JDK. This is my third-party library. And if you implement your own third-party library, you can get a chance for bonus opportunity for the final project. So I have a JSON object. You'll see I try to parse the JSON. This is why I like the library. I just call their own method and it handles the JSON for me. When I parse the JSON, you'll see I have a few information here. I have status equal to OK, and I have a response. So you'll see here, once I try to parse the JSON, is it valid JSON? You'll see when I try to copy that line, I didn't have the entire JSON array, so it wasn't valid. If it's not valid, I'm going to throw an exception, and the JSON object is going to be null. If the JSON object's null, we don't want to continue. If it's not null, which means it's valid JSON, you'll see I have string status. I'm going to try to get this status code here. It's at the very beginning. You'll want to know some basic status code. We go over these in 2830 and 4830. When you get a status code of 200, or if the status says it's okay, that means the request came through properly. So a status code of 200 is okay. So you'll see I'm going to try to get the status. So from this JSON object, I'm going to try to get the status. If the status is equal to okay, proceed. If it's not equal to okay, or if the status is null, throw an exception. Okay, meaning the API returned something, but it didn't return what I wanted. So let's say it returned a 401, or it returned something that we saw earlier. For example, in the browser, if I take this API key off, or if I mess it up a little bit and hit enter, you'll see here, fault string, invalid API key. So I don't even see a status. Status doesn't say okay, something went wrong. So I don't want to even continue if I get this JSON back. I only want to continue when the status is equal to okay. And then I can grab the response. Now you'll notice if I go back to the JSON viewer, it's a JSON array. So if I go to the viewer, let's see if I can put my old JSON back, the one that was valid. If I close this up, I have a JSON object. The JSON object has three things: status, copyright, And then I have another internal JSON object, which has an array of docs and metadata. So the first object has 3 key value pairs. And inside response, I have 2 key value pairs. One of them is an array of all the docs. Okay, you see I have 10 docs here. So we need to parse that. You need to understand the data structure before you proceed. Make sure you view it in a JSON viewer. If I didn't have this JSON viewer and I didn't know this was a nested JSON object, then it'd be really hard for me to parse. You got to understand the structure first before you can proceed. Otherwise, things will be difficult. So you see, I'm going to get the response and I'm going to read that in as a JSON object. And I want to make sure everything's okay with that. Once I get the response, I have the docs. So if I go back, if I open up response, I have docs, and you'll see it has the array brackets, which is a JSON array. Okay, so I have the docs and I read it into a JSON array. And then look at this. I loop through all the docs. So in this example, I have 10 of them. I'm going to loop through all 10 docs. So I'll open up the first one. Okay, let me close these up so it's easier to read. And the first thing is I'm going to create a JSON object from the doc. So I'm going to loop through all the docs and I'm going to create a JSON object called story. And in this story, I'm going to first grab the web URL. So I go back. You'll see here's web URL. It's the HTTPS, so it's actually going to the news article. I'm going to say get or default. So if the web URL is there, I'm going to grab it and store it as a string. Otherwise, I'm going to store an empty string. Then I'm going to look for the snippet. So if I go back, here's the snippet. So I'm going to grab the snippet if it's there. Otherwise, I'm going to store an empty string. So remember, these are key value pairs. JSON is a key value pair structure. So when you specify the key, it's going to return back the value. So when I say snippet, it's going to return back here, a Treasury Department document. Okay, so it's going to return back the value. So I'm going to look for the lead paragraph and the source and the news desk and the section name and the headline. So I'm going to store all this. Now look at the headline. The headline is also an object. So if I go back, you'll see here's headline. Headline is an object. See how it has the 2 mustaches or the 2 brackets there? That's how you know it's an object. See how it has the array annotation here on multimedia? That's how you know it's a JSON array. So that's why I like this JSON viewer. It tells you what the type is. So when I pull out headline, it's another object which has main, kicker, name, print headline, and corresponding information. So if I go back, I'm storing the main headline to an object. And what do I want out of this headline object? You'll see I want the headline. So I check to see, is the headline object not equal to null? If it's not, grab the headline. And you'll see I'm going to grab the main. So if I come back, you'll see here's the main. Okay, here's the main. And I store that to the headline. I'm going to print them all out. I'm going to print them all out to make sure it comes through correctly. And then look at this. I create a New York Times news story object, and I pass all this information to the constructor. Okay, I pass in the constructor. If I go back to the New York Times news story, here's the constructor. It stores all the states. Okay, these are all my states. These are all my behaviors. So it stores all the states, and then it puts it into the array list. So I create a New York Times news story. It's a local variable because it'd be hard to keep track of all of them, but I put it into the array list up here at the top. I put it into the array list so I can keep track of them all. Once I put it into the array list, it's easy to keep track of. It's almost like the threads lecture. Every time I clicked, it made a circle, and I had 100 threads there. I had 100 thread objects. Well, I'm not going to be able to keep track of all those thread objects one by one. So put them in an array list, and when they close the stage, I can destroy all of them. Here, I'm going to put them into an array list, so when I send it back to the controller, I can put all the articles on the GUI, on the UI. And if anything happens, you'll see I throw an exception. And that way the user knows what happened. So there's a lot of exceptions that can occur here. And when I wrote this, I have all the code written here for you, but I also did it piece by piece. So first I cleared the stories. Then I printed out the JSON string. As long as it was there, I got the object and I saw if that worked. I print out the object. As long as the object didn't equal null, and I checked for this because sometimes the object did equal null. So I put an if statement here. And as long as it doesn't equal null, I continue. And then I got to check the status. And as long as that's good, I continue. So I did it piece by piece. If I just wrote all this code at once, I'd have so many bugs and so many problems, it would take forever to write. So I did it piece by piece. I grabbed the response, then I grabbed the docs, then I looped through and I printed them all out. Once I was able to print them all out, I created the object. Once I was able to create the object, I added to the array list. So I did it piece by piece, step by step, which will ensure less bugs. Now I have a few more methods here. I have get new stories, which returns the array list, which is what the controller is going to call. Remember, this is my model. Okay, this is my model, and the model stores a bunch of New York Times news stories. So when I go here, here's my data type. You can think of this as my own custom data type. This is my own object. So my model is going to store an array list of these custom objects. And the custom object has the web URL, the snippet, the lead paragraph, the source, the news desk, the section name, and the headline, as well as the main headline. Okay, and I put them in an array list. You'll see I can get the news stories. I can also get the number of news stories because that's important when I'm creating my UI. Now this should be ready to go. Parsing the JSON, even though I pre-wrote this method so we can create the lecture a little bit quicker, this method took some time to write. So if you use your own API, let's say you use another one from the New York Times, let's say you do books or movie reviews or COVID data, you need to spend a little bit of time and see how the data is structured. Once you understand how the data is structured, then it's easy to pull the data and put it into your application. If you took 2830, we did this with the Mars rover API where we showed the Mars rover photos and we had awesome photos of Mars. And we put that on the web page and you can flip through them. We also did photo of the day from the NASA API. And API is just a great way to put data into your application. They say data is the new gold. Okay, so if you have data, you have gold. If your app doesn't have any data, any default data, you're going to get a point deduction. So either you manually create that data and load it in for the TAs, or you load it from an API. Okay, data is important. Users are important. These are all the new ways that make companies valuable. If you think about Facebook, they don't really have physical assets. They don't have, tractors or cars or boats or airplanes. They have users and they have data. And it's one of the most valuable companies at this point in time. So data and users are very valuable. It's the new gold, or they say data is the new oil. Okay, so it's very important that you have data in your application. And remember, this wasn't built at once. Do it step by step. Okay, so if you change this, you can use this code as an example, but it's going to be modified for your API. Each API is a little bit different, but the overall concept of encoding the search string, printing it out, making sure it works in the browser, then loading it, parsing the data, grabbing the data and parsing it. This is going to be all the same for every API that you use. The only difference is they may not have the status and they may not have the docs. They may have different key value pairs. So that's why it's important you study the data structure. We're getting the data, we're parsing it, we're loading into our custom object, we're putting it into an array list. Now let's get this scene to show up on the UI. Stick with Professor Wergeles and we'll see you in the next video.